Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the December 6th Grand Rounds edition. On this wintry morning, we have Sylvain Coderre, who was the Dean of Undergraduate Medical Education a few years back, I guess 2016. He is now Director of Teacher Development at the Office of Faculty Development and Performance, and he comes to us today to give us a talk on how to become a better teacher. Sylvain is originally from Ottawa, I understand, grew up there and moved to Calgary about 20 years ago. And involved in research and faculty education development. So, for Sylvain.
All right, thank you. So it's the first time I do a hybrid. It's been Zoom for the last 2 years. So I'm just going to put on the chat just before I even, because I don't want to forget. And I will be looking at the chat here. So I do thank you, and I do work currently for the Office of Faculty Development and Performance. And so we run a lot of workshops. You see our advertisements. The other thing we are doing that we're just starting to do, if there's anybody interested, is I or others in our office are very happy to watch people teach. So whether that's a Zoom session, a bedside session, a small group lecture, we will look at your teaching, and then through the framework that I'm going to present today, give feedback on your teaching. And so we've just started this. We've done a few, and I think it's been well received by the two who have done it so far. But yeah, so so that's something I would like to move the office to, is actually one-on-one rather than these group sessions are great, but one-on-one is always obviously more personal. So that's my number one starter. Number two is that I have 18 slides of actual content, 2 slides that have actual data. So I'm not overwhelming you with slides. I will be done talking at 8:40. I know people have clinics at 9 o'clock. And so just to, in case you're wondering, I'm not going to run past 8:40 here. So assuming I can actually move these slides. There we go. So I'm going to talk about the basic structure of memory, but mostly try to rethink how we teach, rethink what we've been, I guess, our approach of teaching to a framework that I'm going to present that really breaks down any educational event into 3 steps. And we're going to talk about those 3 steps, but particularly the last step of this framework, which is something I think as teachers that we don't necessarily think about as often. And so I'm going to present this basic cognitive framework that leads to learning. I'm going to present how it may apply to your teaching, your content design, your mentoring, your coaching of students, residents, and then think about how you might teach or design your curriculum, particularly to emphasize the final step of this framework, which is retrieval. And I'm going to go through this in great detail, but this is really a talk about thinking about, I think we're pretty good at putting information into people. We're not as good as getting information out of people. And it's probably getting information out of people that is more important to teaching, or at least long-term retrieval and retention, than how much we put in initially. I don't have any, other than working for AHS and UFC, I don't have any disclosures, and I've tried to make my slides are very boring. So when you make boring slides, you can't possibly break copyright rules. And so, and of course, I think we are here in person, and I think most people on Zoom, but not necessarily, are on the territories, the current day and traditional territories of Treaty 7 region in southern Alberta, which includes the Blackfoot Confederacy, comprising Siksika, Kainai, and Kainai First Nations, as well as the Tsuut'ina First Nation and Stoney Nakoda, including Chiniki, Bearspaw, and Wesley First Nations. The city of Calgary is also home to the Métis Nation of Alberta Region 3. So I want to frame this talk into this scenario. So I'm going to I'll read it, but you can read it along with me. So your 19-year-old boy is in first year of biology at U of C, comes to you with a concern about having difficulty at school. So he got into biology from high school with marks that were all in the 90s. And now many of the marks are in the C range. Tells you he's studying 4 hours every evening, 8 hours on weekend. Every hour as he studies, he takes a 15-minute break. He studies alone in a room without any visual or auditory distractions. He tries to formulate an approach to each topic, truly fully understand the basic science behind each topic. He's made a schedule where he spends 4 hours on each topic that moves on to the next topic according to his established schedule. So he's upset. Marks aren't going well. What are you going to suggest? And I'm monitoring the chat for those who are at home. For any mentoring, coaching suggestions from the people in the room here. What are we going to do? Studying enough. Good. Okay. Studying is about putting information in. Doing that. Trying to put information in. Taking a 15-minute break every hour. Good idea. I think it's a good idea. Yeah, information in is about limitations of our working memory. Our working memory prefrontal cortex is really the rate limiting neuroanatomical piece in our brain that limits how much can go in. So our working memory probably has 2 to 4 complex topics that we can get through in one individual session. You remember from Psychology 101, the famous 7 blocks. Well, those 7 blocks were pieces were numbers that people were remembering. So they weren't complex topics. When we're talking about, when you're presenting a complex topic to someone, you probably only have 2, at most 4 complex topics that you can present in any given session. So that again is really about putting information in, and as a study mode, taking breaks is the best way to refresh that working memory. To take a break, think about something else, and then you might be able to get more information in. So far, I'm pretty happy with the approach to getting information in. Formulating an approach. We always talk about an approach to chest pain, approach to ECGs. Good thing, great thing. It's a great way to store information in our long-term memory, that rather than thinking about all the different pieces of information about chest pain, we can sort of bundle it into cardiac, pulmonary, and sort of right away we have an easy access to big pieces of information in long-term memory. So excellent. Understanding the basic science of things really helps you code your information in long-term memory stronger. The stronger the code, the more likely you are to retrieve. But what's the problem, person? Information's getting in. Can't retrieve it. Okay, so we have to think of those. They are different steps. The techniques we use as teachers, as learners, to get information in are different than the techniques about getting information out. Forgetting is a problem with retrieval. It's there, but we just can't retrieve it. So what about this notion of spending, okay, let's say biology, there's maybe plant biology and then there's human biology. Boys spending 4 hours on plants and then 4 hours on human. Is that a good thing? That's basically learning in blocks. We love learning in blocks. It's actually a bad thing for education. So learners love to learn in blocks. Teachers love to teach in blocks. But it's been shown in about every field you can think of, whether it's medicine, whether it's sports, whether it's, music, that dispersing is better. So little pieces of anemia, then go to chest pain, and then go to dyspnea, and then back to platelets, is better than learning all of hematology, all of cardiology, all of pulmonary. We like that approach as learners and teachers. It doesn't work as well. Spending 4 hours on your serve game in tennis one day and then the next day all backhand is not as good as random teaching. So it is better for learners to disperse, just learn a little bit of one topic, move on. Why? Because every time you go back to that topic you learned a little bit about, you probably review it again before you move on to new pieces. So that's a retrieval. That's a getting information out technique. How else can we get information out? Testing ourselves. So as a teacher, yeah, in the GI, when I have a learner with me for a week, I actually have created multiple choice questions, but that's weird. Okay, I got it. But what's not weird is questioning people. So I taught you about appendicitis Monday. Often we think that's it. Okay, we've covered appendicitis, we're done. Go come back to it Wednesday. A little bit of a quiz on, you've learned how to approach the ECG on Monday. What was that approach to ECG on Wednesday, Thursday? You're forcing retrieval. That is a test of a student. The other thing that really helps to retrieve is teaching yourself or others. Okay, so what I would tell this person is you're doing everything right to put information in. You're doing everything wrong to get information out. You need to test yourself, teach yourself or someone else, and disperse the information. Learn a little bit about this, new topic, come back to that other topic. So that's the fundamental of this framework that I'm going to go through. And is this separating how information comes in and comes out, because the techniques are different. And of course, I was in a cardiology round. So this is a slide from Sarah Weeks about learners and difficulty. And we always have to think about that most learners in difficulty are having difficulty, actually, just having difficulty with their life, maybe something going on in their life. It may be something about the teacher so that this is a sort of a mnemonic about, how things, when somebody's in difficulty, it can be knowledge, skills, attitudes. And then it could be a problem with the learner, a problem with the teacher, and a problem with the system. And a lot of times it is a problem. So my first question to my boy would be, actually, are you okay? Are things going well? So it may not have to do at all with any of these steps of cognition. It may be something that we need to fix other than cognition. But we'll really focus today about what goes on in our brains, the basic steps of cognition. And so I'm going to go through this framework that I've kind of introduced here. But my real objectives is to remove one sentence out of your teaching vocabulary and add two. You can forget those three other objectives. This is really what I would like you to do, is remove one sentence and add two. So what would I like you to remove? Alan Jones, that some of you know, is a hematologist, but I always say 5 most dangerous words in education. We have already covered that. Okay, we have already covered that is a very information in mentality. This presumes that I'm such a great teacher that the normal laws of human cognition don't apply to me, and therefore nobody's ever going to have trouble retrieving what I teach. Okay, that's not the case for anybody. I'm sorry. Okay, so we have already covered that as a very dangerous. It just does not reflect actually how cognition works. So it has to come out of our vocabulary. And this is a really great website. It's retrievalpractice.org, and it really focuses, it has a whole host of techniques about retrieval, the science behind retrieval. But really, the nice quote from that is, learning strategies should focus on getting information out, not in. And that's kind of what I wanted to highlight. Obviously, you need to get it in the first place, right? Like, you're not going to start with a retrieval exercise if there's actually nothing. But we're pretty good at in, but it's in, right? I think if you think about your own teaching, how much of it comes in, how much of it is actually drawing it out? I think we're way better at in than the out part. And true learning is not about how much time, but how many times. So I'll take credit for that one. That's my own personal motto, is how much time is about in. Okay, so there's no question that I have like less than an hour today. If I tested you right after this session, for sure, if I taught you for an hour right now or 4, I could probably get more in 4 hours if I did a test right after this session. But that's not my goal, is it? My goal is for you to go away and in 3 months, 6 months, 2 weeks, doesn't matter, to be able to retrieve some of these. So that's about how much time, if it's possible. So I will not get another shot at this group, I don't think. Yeah, okay, yeah. But if I did, I would start my next session with a review of this session, which would be a way to retrieve, right? So that is how many times is actually more important to retrieval than how much time. And that's again been shown. And I'll show you again. I have 2 data slides, so I'm not overwhelming you with data, but one is a really nice study that I think. So the basic cognitive framework is this from a medical teacher 2018 article that Genevieve Desi, that some of you will know, is the lead author in general internist at the Foothills. And so what it really just reminds us is that there's this broadly speaking, a 2-step process to true learning. The first one takes the learner, which is, obviously the green box on the left-hand side. And the information does have to get into long-term memory, the purple rectangle. That's the in part. So that's the acquisition of knowledge. It has to get through this light blue box. The working memory is the most vulnerable part of our neuroanatomy, and particularly vulnerable the more novice, right? So if you're going off to teach a very novice learner, when I say 2 to 4 in a session, it's probably more like 2, new concepts. The 4 you can get away with if it's a more experienced learner who've heard the topic before, therefore they're not really using their working memory. They're probably interacting with their long-term memory, which is infinite, right? So the first phase of learning is about thinking. The in part is about, okay, I have a learner in front of me with a limited working memory. I'm going to limit my topics to 2 to 4 at most. And if you're studying, taking breaks, that kind of thing is a really good way to refresh your working memory. How many times in a single lecture do we actually stop and give learners a chance to refresh their working memory? Stop. You're in a 1 hour lecture. All right, I just presented the rate rhythm part of ECG. Why don't you talk to your neighbor, go over an example. There's no new information going in, and then we'll come back to axis and the rest, right? So that is a good technique to think about to think about the limitations of our working memory. Long-term memory is infinite. How we can help that long-term memory is things that I mentioned the student was doing: organizational structure, basic science understanding. Those help code or cue the information so we can retrieve it a little bit easier the next time. So that is the first stage of learning. Yes. Good question. Excellent question. I don't know the answer. I've looked this up. And I don't know that anybody's come up with but I would say, just from my general reading, that it's probably really at least 5 minutes. Yeah. I would say, I don't think 10 minutes is probably a little long, and 2 minutes is probably a little short. But really, when you think about right now, in this talk right now, everybody who's listening can refresh their working memory, right? Because, it's a great question, but they may not be interested in your question, right? So I know it's tough to believe, but so they get that. This is great, right? Because it gives everybody a chance to kind of think about something else. And so, but yeah, I would probably have to interact with you for 5 minutes, to really, truly refresh that working memory. But in a lecture, what I like to do is, present, and you can tell as a teacher instinctively when the learner they've reached their limitation, right? They're looking away, their eye contact is a little bit, and you even feel it. but often it was just, I just got to get these extra two. I just have to say these two extra things. They're gonna pound it in there. I got to pound it in there. Well, if you have the opportunity in a lecture, why not say? I mean, that's why I said the ECG example. Why do rate, rhythm, access, intervals, and all at once and see you later? I have no idea what the learner remembered. Really, is it the first one? Is it the last one? It's probably the first and the last. Why not stop and say, okay, rate, rhythm is complex enough. Here, take 5 minutes. Here's an ECG. Talk to your neighbor. And as you're talking to the neighbor, you're kind of teaching yourself, you're helping your long-term memory. Yeah, so in a long-winded answer, I don't know that we know the specific answer, but I would say it's at least 2 minutes, but probably best 5 minutes. And any workshop that I do frequently take 5-minute breaks. Yeah. So that is the information in part. And so the acquisition is what we're talking about. It's talking about the limitations of working memory and how do I help this long-term memory code or cue the information. Well, it's really about an organizational structure, learning basic science, which cardiology is excellent at. Permanence of myocardial oxygen demand is a really solid way to try to remember why I use beta blockers and calcium channels. This is a really good way of actually cueing long-term memory. Now we need to think about information out. And you're welcome to these slides. So I'm not going to, this is sort of a summary slide that really goes through the 3 steps. So I've mentioned the first 2 steps, which both have to do with acquisition. Storage is, how do I deal with limitations of working memory? And we talked about refreshing that working memory, limited topics. How do I help code or cue that information? I can give a science, I can help give people a structure. And this whole concept of desirable difficulty is what I mentioned about spacing things out. It's actually harder to learn that way. It's harder to learn by little chunks of this moving on, but it's actually better. It's desirable difficulty. It's more difficult, but it's desirable. But most people who are having trouble can't retrieve the information. So now I'm going to focus on the retrieval part. So, and I think about this every time I teach something, as I think about, have I done enough to promote retrieval, whether it's a 10-minute session on whatever, or a 1-hour lecture. Have I tried my best to promote this part, this retrieval part? And so this part here, which by the way has to go back to our working memory, our limitations of working memory. So we've all had that experience where at 3 in the morning when we're tired and we're stressed, we got a lot of things on our mind, and you just can't remember something that you actually, you know this person's name. I've worked with this person all day and now suddenly I can't remember their name. That's the limitations of working memory. There's too many things going. So it applies, it's vulnerable in and it's vulnerable out as well, our working memory. Things have to go through it in and have to come back to it to get it out. So this is the one data piece that, well, there's 2 slides, but yeah. So this is I really like this Larson author. He's a neurologist. And so I'll summarize this. Ultimately, this paper had residents in pediatrics and emergency medicine. And they gave them a 1-hour lecture. And they describe it as super interactive, like people had to draw diagrams. And so they did everything you could to promote the in part, like to really have an interactive, refreshed working memory on 2 topics, status epilepticus and myasthenia gravis. And then they tested that whole group on status epilepticus and myasthenia gravis. They were short answer questions. They weren't multiple choice. And you can see that right after the session, that in part, the acquisition is pretty good. Like they scored 78 and 62, both, the whole group. But then what they did is they divided the group. So for status epilepticus, half had more tests. So 2 weeks later, they gave them just a test. Then 3 weeks later, another, 4 weeks later, a test. And then 6 months later, a test. That was one group. The other group, every time these people had a test, they had a working sheet, like a sheet of information to study more. They were the same 40 topics that were in the test were in the study sheet. And so at the end of the 6 months, you could see that the group that was given more tests did better in the final analysis as the group that was asked to study more. And the same happened, even more pronounced for myasthenia gravis, that the people who were tested more did overall better than the group that was given more time to study. That's interesting. But what I really find interesting about this study is the humbling nature of education. Look how well we do right after the session. And 6 months later, we're down to about, without any testing, we're down to less than half of the information. And by the way, they gave them the same test, like, which I think is a kind of a flaw, but kind of a nice thing about the design. If you can't even remember the same test that you had, what are your chances of remembering something new, something where you actually have to, maybe it's not exactly the same in the clinical environment, but you have to kind of adapt it a little bit. It's really, and by the way, this acquisition is amazing. We know in lectures, it's probably like 20% is how much, if you tested people right after. So I think what this study reminds us is two things. One is that without any other intervention, the decay is real. And this again has been reproduced in a number of studies. The decay is real. And if you're going to, you can see it's like a booster to me. It's like a vaccination testing, right? So they decayed, but you can see a little bump in this group from that test. That test inoculated them a little bit. So they kind of got a little bit of a bump here, and then they go back down. So this is the limitations of our in decays. And we have to, tests is testing, which again, this was a formal test, but it doesn't have to be a formal test, is better than more studying. And this is why I always encourage groups like this. You have academic half days, right? How many times do you have a topic on week 1 of academic half day? Is week 2 a totally different topic? Is week 3 a totally different topic? How many times do you come back to the topics from week 1, 2, and 3? Have to. Okay, we have already covered that are the 5 most dangerous words of education. If I had to design an academic half day, every 4th week would be a review of week 1, 2, and 3. And even better, that week 4 review would be by the learners. So this is the same group of Larson who also presented a lecture initially and then broke the group down into 4 groups. They said, this group, first group will get you to study more. The second group, we're going to give you material, you're going to study, but you're going to have material to explain it to yourself. So teach yourself. The third group was given testing material. And the 4th group was given tested material with material to self-explain. And the best of the best is to have tests and to be able to self-explain. So I think if you're designing a longitudinal curriculum, this notion that we're never going to come back to week 1, 2, because we've done that. That Larson paper I just showed you tells you what happens to your information. It decays. Think about getting a purposeful retrieval exercises into the sessions, and even better, that the learners just, even if it's ad hoc, week 4, hey, what was week 1 again? And then you just chat about it. Maybe have a slide or 2, and it just, that bang for the buck of inoculate, it's like a vaccine, it's a vaccine boost, is actually been shown in a number of studies to really be our best hope at retrieval. This is what the inoculum does, is that we feel really good after one session, and I can probably test you right now after this session. And maybe you've learned some stuff, but we are all on this red curve. As learners, we're all on the forgetting curve. And as I don't care how good a teacher you are, your learners are on the forgetting curve. Every time you come back to something, you're putting learners on the green curve. It's that vaccine boost. And you know this as learners. Every time you reread a topic, how much quicker does it come back? How much quicker does it come back? And we know this instinctively. There's a resistance somehow to design our sessions. And this is even a 10-minute session. You can inoculate in that 10, or a 1 week with a learner, come back to the top. If they're that important to your don't think, okay, I've done ECGs, so let's get into the 58 causes of cardiomyopathy. No. If it's a clerk, the ECG is more important. Come back to it. Inoculate them, boost them during that week. So here's yes. Let's talk about, so I'll answer your question, and I do want to go over this. Yeah. Yes. Oh. Yeah. No, that's a test. So online, the question is, what constitutes a test? To me, what constitutes a test is anything that promotes information to come out. So a learner that goes online and writes MCQs is a test for sure. Like, it doesn't have to be administered in a formal fashion. Me teaching someone about cirrhosis on Monday and on Wednesday saying, remember we talked about the 8 sort of common causes of cirrhosis? Can you repeat them back to me? Is a test. And I've actually written an MCQ for at the end of a week for groups of learners. Not sure how much they liked it, but that's obviously a very formal test. Even better, and again, it depends on the learner, how comfortable they are, but we have teams of people, and sometimes we go over a case of cirrhosis with one learner. The others weren't there. Well, ask that learner, remember we talked about cirrhosis? Can you teach the rest of the group about cirrhosis and what we talked about? Again, you have to pick and choose, right? You have to be careful. Like, you don't want to, it's not about public humiliation. If you don't feel that person is up to it, don't do it. But that is really powerful. That's a test. I mean, you're forcing the person to draw it out and actually then explain it to someone. That's a powerful test. So I think broadly speaking, for sure, like if you look at the literature, it's more formal testing. Like, that when they talk about test retest, they're talking about MCQs or short answer questions. But going online and testing yourself at our medical school, we have these cards, right? They're virtual patients that their deck of cards with chest pain, and this one's pericarditis, this one's dissection, that's a test. It's anything that's drawing information out is a test. And we can do it even just by informal questioning. But I would actually argue that if you're going to do that, try to do it separate at a different time, not necessarily right after your in part. You do it an hour later, 10 minutes later, as you're walking to the next patient and emerge. Or 2 days later, even better. Yes. Yeah. Yeah. Yes. Yeah. So that's a great question. The question is about group studying. And I'm trying to think of something that's actually a really good question. I can't quote you a paper off the top of my head, but I think there's two answers to that. I mean, some people just don't like it, right? Like some people don't like to, but for sure what a group does right away is what you've said, right? There's no way you're in a group and you're not teaching each other, right? So everything about that is retrieval, right? And then, there's a piece of information missing, so you're going to go look for it. So there's a bit of an intake component. But even better, if a group is studying for the Royal College or a cardiology exam, every single time you meet with the group, you go back to what you learned the last time with a quick refresher. Yeah, I'd have to look again. Yeah, that's a great question of whether people have randomized people to to group versus individual studying. And my suspicion is the group would be better. But yeah, for all those reasons, a group is really about retrieval. Yeah, me too. Yeah, when you get it, absolutely. So we're talking about, yeah, when you get into that, you're talking about personalities, right? I'm as much as I spend my life teaching, I'm actually an introvert. I would way rather be in my basement watching the Blue Jays, to be honest with you, right? So that's my comfort zone. And so I studied alone, but I didn't actually study alone. I taught myself. I actually would verbalize out loud, and it was weird to anybody else that was in it. But that is, so it was like a group, but I was alone. But yeah, so I think a mixture of both is obviously better. And what a group brings, of course, is explanation, clarification, and then of course the social interaction. But a group fundamentally is a really great, strong retrieval exercise for sure. When we think of this person again, and this is my effort in retrieval, is that the studying part, studying more is not all. If you're not studying, studying more is the answer. I mean, you have to get it in, right? It's not going to magically get in from retrieval. Like, it has to come in. So if you're studying 0 hours, then start at studying, right? Okay, so you can come back to me when you've actually cracked that book open a little bit, right? But studying, taking breaks, no distractions, is about our working memory. It's about the limitations of our working memory. Providing an organizational structure, basic science concepts, dispersing like little chunks here and there, is about strengthening that code in long-term memory. But the retrieval part is about testing. It's about verbalizing, self-teaching. I really like the group concept there. And again, the more you disperse or block teach, the better it is, because every time you do that, you're probably refreshing the last session. Again, you're welcome to my slides. And I said 8:40, 8:43, so it's not bad. Any questions here, or are there been some great questions or from the online? I'm just looking at the chat. Again, we do this, we do workshops on this. We do, of course, anybody who's interested, we have lots of courses on this kind of thing. And of course, individual. When I look at a teacher and I look at a teacher and I look at you teach, I'm going to think about, are they promoting storage? Are they promoting coding? And are they practicing retrieval? And where do you think people are better at? We're better at storage, and we're better at the in than the out. Yeah. So I think there was a question. Yeah. Yes. Yeah. So the question is about individuals who have poor exam, who are not doing well. Maybe it's an exam anxiety or an exam. So when I went through that, I went through the that learner and difficulty, Sarah Weeks' slide very quickly. But one of the things that we appreciated is that, a lot of, as I said, the first thing I would do to a learner in difficulty is make sure they're okay. Like, make sure there really is, actually, they're healthy and everything. That they, I still remember an oncologist, I was doing general medicine, and his opening statement when we first met on the Monday was, if anybody here has something going on that isn't allowing them to perform at their peak performance, please let me know. And I've never forgotten that. I think that's such a nice way of saying, hey, come to me if you're actually struggling with something. And then of course, some people have trouble with MCQs, and in studies, about 3 to 5% of medical students, and maybe up to 10% of the general population, have an actual learning disability that hasn't been uncovered. So 3% in a class of 150 is a pretty impressive number, actually. It's a handful of students. So that's, yeah. And then of course there's the testing anxiety. I do think that, without again strong necessary data, I think that testing and retest may help that anxiety. But of course, most of what I'm talking about when I'm saying test and retest is a low stakes, not certifying, sort of formative type of testing, right? Whether it will help with an actual high stakes when when the room is closed and then you have the paper, that anxiety, I think it might, but I'm not really sure that's a really different scenario. But I think what helps the exam anxiety is that comfort that I know this stuff and I can actually retrieve this stuff because I did it, right? So that's actually going. So I have to think it would help. Whether I don't have any sort of formal studies, I can sort of off the top of my head to kind of say, or whether that's even been looked at. Yeah. Yeah. But I think for sure, I mean, if you think about, does practice in golf help you on the 18th fairway when you've got 150 in? Doesn't help me, but it probably helps, the person, people are actually good, that you've been there and you can rely on, and that's the technique you want to use, is to visualize where it went well before, right? Like, so if it never went well before, then you've got a problem, right? But if you've tested yourself and it went well, then at least you can visualize that, right? Yeah. Right. Yeah. 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 Well, but actually, yeah. So, but when I went through internal medicine, those boxes were the actual exam. So that's not really that's actually not test retest. That's not test retest. That's actually rote memorization of the answers. Yeah. But yeah, I'm hoping they modified it. Yes. Yeah. So writing stuff down. So note taking. I think note taking so there's some evidence that doodling actually helps your working memory, but I think note taking is a reflection of when we realize that as humans that our working memory is reaching its limitations. Like there's just no more that's going to come in. I think that's when we reach to the pen, right? Because then we know, okay, I don't feel like it's going to go in, but I'll write it out at least, and then I'll remember it, right? So that's why I think technology. So writing notes is the precursor to podcasts, right? And what podcasts do, and what I like about podcasts, is it actually hits all of these, right? If I go back to a podcast, I control the input as the learner, right? I can stop anytime. And so what I would say as a lecturer, we got to kind of relinquish the in part to the learners a little bit, like take a break, like, like not make it like, so think about it as a podcast. The learner can stop you anytime. So stop yourself, as a lecturer anytime. What a learner can do in a podcast is stop and then look something up, or, I can look at the approach to chest pain and get a structure, that science concept, that acid base. I don't understand, so I need to look up. And then they can look at it as many times as they want, right? So the beauty of note writing, and I would say podcast does all of that. I think it's when we acknowledge that our working memory is a little bit overwhelmed, we're going to start writing notes, and in that way later, I can control the input. I control the input to my working memory. I can then retrieve it in a way. So it kind of fits that framework. Podcasts have helped reduce the need for note taking, but people still like taking notes. I'm not sure that I believe that if I'm talking and you're note taking, that there's no way that what you're writing down is actually getting in, or my voice. It's impossible, I think, but it's there for later use. Yeah. But when you think about when you're at the second cup teaching and there's no opportunity for the learner to write notes, like think about that. You've got 2 to 4. And I think we feel it and they feel it. And you can see it in their eyes, when you've reached that limit. And the problem with that is if you keep going, you get into the situation that we're in, that people will never forget that scorpion bites causes pancreatitis, but they forget that alcohol and gallstones cause pancreatitis. So you don't know what's going to go in. Like once you overwhelm the working memory, you have no idea what's actually going to stick. And it may not be what you want to stick. So take control of what you want to stick by limiting the topics. But retrieve them. No chat questions. So yeah. No. All right. Thank you for.
Thank you, everyone. We'll close out the session today.